There's a house on Marlowe Street, an unassuming two-story home with peeling paint and a yard that looks perpetually dead. People whispered about it for years, about how it used to belong to the Stover family. They moved in one summer, eager for a fresh start, but by fall, all 6 members were dead. No one moved in after that. Claire, a freelance photographer, didn't believe in ghost stories. She heard the tales, sure, murmured warnings about strange shadows and flickering lights. But to her, the Stover house was just an old building, a perfect subject for a photo essay about urban legends. With her camera in hand, Claire arrived at sunset. The air was heavy with a silence that wrapped itself around her like a wet blanket. She felt a slight pang of unease, but brushed it off. The front door was unlocked, as if waiting for her. She stepped inside. The air smelled stale, like damp wood and forgotten memories. Her flashlight beam danced across peeling wallpaper and broken furniture. She snapped a few pictures of the staircase, the broken banister, and a single shoe lying forgotten in the hallway. As she crouched to get a closer shot, she thought she heard something, a faint creak upstairs. "Just the house settling," she muttered, her voice too loud in the suffocating quiet. She made her way to the living room. An old piano sat in the corner, its keys yellowed with age. She approached it, running her fingers lightly over the keys without pressing them. A sudden sound echoed behind her, a single, soft note from the piano. Claire froze, her pulse hammering in her ears. The flashlight flickered. "Old wiring," she whispered, trying to convince herself. She raised her camera to snap a picture of the piano, but as the flash went off, something reflected in the lens, a figure standing in the hallway. Claire spun around, the beam of her flashlight sweeping the space. There was nothing there. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she reviewed the photo on her camera. Her blood turned to ice. In the picture, there was a woman, barely more than a shadow, wearing a tattered white dress. Her face was obscured by long, dark hair. Claire told herself it was a trick of the light, but her hands were shaking. She decided to leave. Her curiosity had been satisfied. As she turned toward the front door, a loud bang reverberated through the house like something heavy had fallen upstairs. Against her better judgment, Claire pointed the flashlight toward the staircase. "Hello?" she called, her voice trembling. Silence answered her. She took a tentative step forward, then another. The stairs creaked beneath her weight. At the top, the hallway stretched before her like a tunnel. There were 3 doors, all slightly ajar. The air was colder up here, enough to make her shiver. She approached the first door and pushed it open with her foot. The room was empty, save for a bed frame and a wardrobe. She turned to the second door, nudging it open. A child's room, the walls adorned with faded animal wallpaper. On the floor lay a stuffed rabbit, its fur matted and gray. She felt an almost unbearable sadness emanating from the space, but she couldn't explain why. The third door was closed. Unlike the others, it didn't budge when she pushed on it. She leaned her weight into it, and it flew open with a groan. The room was dark, the flashlight's beams swallowed by the void. Then the smell hit her, coppery and thick like blood. Claire gagged, covering her nose and mouth with her sleeve. She took a step back, but before she could turn, the door slammed shut. Her flashlight flickered, then went out. Panic clawed at her chest. She jiggled the doorknob, but it wouldn't turn. The sound of breathing filled the room, deep, labored breaths that weren't hers. "Who's there?" she screamed, her voice cracking. The breathing stopped. The silence was worse. Something cold brushed against her arm, and she screamed again, backing into the door. The camera strap around her neck jerked violently, pulling her forward. She clawed at the strap, but it tightened, choking her. In her desperation, she kicked at the door until it finally gave way, spilling her into the hallway. She scrambled to her feet, sprinting down the stairs. The front door was wide open. She didn't stop to question it. She bolted out into the night, running until her lungs burned. It wasn't until she reached her car that she realized she was still wearing the camera. She ripped it off and tossed it onto the passenger seat. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely get the keys into the ignition. The car roared to life, and she sped away, never looking back. When Claire finally got home, she felt safe for the first time since entering the house. She showered, trying to scrub away the memory of that suffocating darkness. Exhausted, she collapsed into bed. Her phone buzzed in the middle of the night, waking her. She groggily picked it up. It was a notification from her camera app. New images detected. Her stomach churned as she opened the gallery. There were photos she didn't remember taking, blurry, grainy images of the house's hallway, the stairs, and the third room. The last picture froze her blood. It was her, standing in her bedroom, staring into the lens, with the shadowy figure from the house right behind her. Every town has a stretch of road people avoid. For Halderville, it was Birchwood Drive. Winding through dense woods, the road was cloaked in shadows even during the day. Stories circulated about people disappearing there, cars breaking down only for the drivers to vanish without a trace. But Nick wasn't superstitious. He prided himself on being logical, grounded. When his GPS rerouted him down Birchwood Drive late one stormy night, he shrugged and followed the directions. The rain fell in sheets, hammering against his windshield, making it hard to see beyond the swipes of his wipers. The radio crackled, fading in and out as static swallowed the station. Nick adjusted the dial, but every frequency was the same. Harsh, grating white noise. His headlights caught a figure standing at the edge of the road. A woman in a drenched dress, her hair plastered to her face. She stood unnaturally still, her head tilted slightly to the side as if listening to something Nick couldn't hear. He slowed the car, rolling down his window slightly. "Hey, are you okay?" he called out. The woman didn't respond. She took one stiff step toward him, her movements jerky, wrong. Rain streaked her pale face. Nick's pulse quickened. Something wasn't right. He rolled the window back up and hit the gas, speeding past her. A few minutes later, the static on the radio stopped. A voice broke through, a whisper, barely audible. "Don't stop again." Nick's breath caught in his throat. He glanced at the radio, but the display showed no station, just numbers that flickered nonsensically. He tightened his grip on the wheel and pressed the pedal harder. The road seemed endless, the trees closing in around him. Then his car jolted violently. A blowout. The steering wheel wrenched in his hands as he fought to keep control, pulling the car to the side of the road. The engine sputtered and died, leaving him in silence except for the relentless drumming of the rain. Nick cursed under his breath, grabbing his phone. No signal. He reached into the glove compartment for a flashlight and stepped out into the rain. The world was pitch black beyond his headlights, the surrounding woods feeling alive, as though they were watching him. The tire was shredded beyond repair. He'd have to walk. As he swung the beam of the flashlight down the road, his heart sank. The woman was there again, standing in the middle of the road, closer than before. Nick swallowed hard. "Who are you?" he shouted, his voice cracking. She didn't move. "Stay away," he warned, stepping back toward his car. The flashlight flickered, and when the beam steadied again, she was gone. Nick spun around, the light darting through the trees, but there was no sign of her. He climbed back into his car, locking the doors. His breaths came shallow and fast. The rain eased, leaving only the sound of water dripping from the trees. He was about to try the ignition again when a soft, rhythmic tap came from the passenger side window. Nick froze. Slowly, he turned his head. The woman's face was pressed against the glass, her eyes wide, empty, and black. Her mouth moved soundlessly, forming words he couldn't hear. Nick screamed, fumbling with the keys, but his fingers slipped. When he looked back at the window, she was gone. The car roared to life, and he slammed it into drive, tearing down the road. His heart pounded as he kept glancing in the rearview mirror, expecting to see her behind him. But the road remained empty. Relief washed over him as he saw headlights in the distance, a gas station, bright and welcoming. He pulled in, parking haphazardly near the entrance. The cashier inside gave him a puzzled look as Nick stumbled in, soaked and trembling. "You look like you've seen a ghost," the cashier said, half joking. There was a woman on the road. Something's wrong with her," Nick stammered. The cashier's face fell. "Birchwood Drive?" Nick nodded. "Man, you're lucky you got away. Most don't." "What are you talking about?" The cashier gestured toward a bulletin board near the back. Nick approached, his legs feeling like lead. Tacked to the board were faded flyers of missing people. One photo caught his eye, a grainy image of a young woman in a white dress. "She's been missing for 10 years, the cashier said. "People say she died out there, hit by a drunk driver. Her body was never found. They say she waits for someone to take her home, but if you stop..." Nick backed away, shaking his head. He didn't want to hear more. He paid for a coffee, hands trembling as he grabbed the cup. When he got back to his car, something felt wrong. The air inside was frigid, and his rearview mirror was tilted downward. He reached up to adjust it and froze. In the reflection, the woman sat in the back seat, her black eyes staring at him through the mirror. Anna had always been a night owl, working late into the evenings as a graphic designer from the comfort of her apartment. The quiet hours fueled her creativity, and the soft hum of her computer was the only companion she needed. But one night, something changed. It started with a notification, an email from an unknown sender. The subject line read, "Do not turn around." Anna smirked, dismissing it as a spam message. She didn't bother opening it, dragging it to the trash. Her fingers returned to her keyboard, and she became immersed in her work. The rhythmic tapping of the keys filled the room, accompanied by the occasional creak of her old chair. An hour later, her screen flickered. Just a glitch, she thought, until the email popped back into her inbox. The subject line, bold and insistent, "Do not turn around." A chill crept up her spine. Anna hesitated, curiosity overpowering her better judgment. She clicked it open. The email was blank, except for one sentence at the bottom. "It's watching you." Her breath hitched. She glanced at the webcam perched on her monitor, instinctively covering it with her hand. A quick scan of the room revealed nothing out of the ordinary. Just her desk, the small couch, and the kitchen beyond it. But the unease lingered, an itch she couldn't scratch. She closed the email and returned to her work, trying to ignore the creeping anxiety. Moments later, her computer screen froze. The cursor wouldn't move, the keyboard unresponsive. Then, without warning, the monitor went black. Her reflection stared back at her from the dark screen. For a split second, she thought she saw something move behind her, a shadow that didn't belong to her. She spun around, her chair creaking loudly, but the room was empty. Anna's heart raced as she turned back to her computer. The screen was still black, but words began to appear in a faint, glowing font. "You shouldn't have looked." Her chest tightened. She unplugged the computer in a panic, but the words remained on the screen, growing brighter. "It's here now." Her apartment suddenly felt colder. The air seemed heavier, pressing down on her shoulders. She backed away from the desk, clutching her phone. She dialed 911, but before she could hit call, the screen of her phone flickered, and a new message appeared. "They can't help you." The lights in the apartment dimmed. Anna felt it before she saw it, a presence, dark and oppressive, filling the space behind her. Her breath came in short gasps, and she fought the urge to look over her shoulder. The urge became unbearable, like a voice in her head whispering, "Turn around." Tears welled in her eyes as she clenched them shut, whispering to herself, "It's not real. It's not real." The whispering grew louder, coming from everywhere and nowhere. It wasn't a single voice. It was many, layered on top of one another, chanting incoherent words. Her hands trembled as she reached blindly for the door, desperate to escape. She stumbled into the hallway, slamming the door behind her. The whispering stopped. The silence was deafening. Anna leaned against the wall, her chest heaving. She didn't dare go back inside. She decided to call her friend Mia and stay the night at her place. As she fumbled with her phone, she felt a vibration in her hand. It was another email notification. This time the subject line read, "Look up." Her stomach dropped. Against every ounce of logic screaming at her to ignore it, she glanced upward. The hallway light flickered, revealing a figure clinging to the ceiling. Its limbs were unnaturally long, and its face was obscured by a curtain of matted black hair. It turned its head toward her, revealing a twisted, toothless grin. Its empty eyes met hers, and it dropped down with a sickening thud. The last thing Anna saw was her phone screen, the glowing words, "We told you not to look." Eric had been looking for a fresh start. The cabin deep in the woods seemed perfect, cheap, secluded, and far from the chaos of the city. When he arrived, he found it exactly as advertised. A quaint wooden structure with a stone fireplace, surrounded by towering pines. It felt peaceful, almost too peaceful. The first few days were uneventful. Eric spent his time unpacking and exploring the surrounding trails. But on the fourth night, something woke him. A soft, rhythmic tapping. He sat up in bed, straining to hear over the wind rustling through the trees. The tapping grew louder, coming from the direction of the window. Eric hesitated, his pulse quickening. He reached for the flashlight on his nightstand and shined it toward the window. Nothing. Just the swaying branches and the dark forest beyond. "Probably just a bird," he muttered, lying back down. But the tapping didn't stop. It grew more deliberate, more insistent. Annoyed, Eric threw on a jacket and stepped outside. The air was crisp, and the forest was eerily silent. "Hello?" he called out, shining the flashlight around. The beam of light caught something, just for a second, darting behind a tree. His stomach tightened. "Hey! Whoever's out there, this isn't funny!" There was no response. He scanned the woods, but the flashlight's beam seemed swallowed by the darkness. Shaking his head, he went back inside, locking the door behind him. As he climbed back into bed, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He pulled the covers up and closed his eyes, willing sleep to come. He woke again, this time to silence. His clock read 3:17 a.m. The tapping had stopped. Relieved, he rolled over, only to freeze. The flashlight, which he'd left on the nightstand, was now on the floor, rolling slowly toward him. Eric's blood ran cold. He scanned the room, but nothing seemed out of place. Slowly, he got out of bed, picking up the flashlight. He shined it toward the window again. This time, there was a handprint. The print was smeared, as though something or someone had pressed their hand against the glass and dragged it downward. Eric's breath hitched. He grabbed his phone and dialed the nearest ranger station. But the call didn't go through. No signal. That's when he heard it. A faint, raspy voice coming from the direction of the fireplace. "Help me." Eric's flashlight trembled in his hand as he turned toward the sound. The fireplace was empty, the ashes undisturbed. Help me." The voice came again, clearer this time. It was coming from inside the cabin. Eric backed toward the door, fumbling with the lock. As he turned the handle, a loud thud came from the ceiling directly above him. His heart raced as he looked up. The old wooden beams creaked under the weight of something heavy moving across them. He bolted outside, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. He didn't stop running until he reached the edge of the woods, where the faint glow of dawn was beginning to light the sky. He called the authorities as soon as he got a signal. When they arrived later that morning, Eric led them back to the cabin. It was quiet now, almost serene in the daylight. The rangers searched the cabin but found nothing unusual until they checked the attic. The hatch to the attic was slightly ajar. One of the rangers climbed up, shining his light into the darkness. "Jesus," the man muttered, pulling back quickly. "What? What is it?" Eric demanded. The ranger stepped aside, his face pale. "You need to see this." Eric climbed the ladder, his hands shaking. The attic was small and dusty, filled with cobwebs and forgotten debris. But in the far corner, he saw it. A makeshift bed made of old blankets and clothes. Surrounding it were dozens of drawings, scrawled in black charcoal. They were of him. Eric's face stared back at him from every scrap of paper, twisted into expressions of fear, pain, and terror. As he backed away, his foot brushed something. He looked down to see a knife, its blade smeared with dried blood. "You said you've been here alone?" the ranger asked, his voice tight. Eric nodded, his mouth dry. The ranger hesitated, then pointed to one of the drawings. "It's dated," he said. Eric leaned closer, his stomach twisting. The date scrawled in the corner wasn't from the past. It was from that morning. Lila loved her late-night runs. The world was quiet, the streets empty, and the cool air always seemed to clear her mind. She'd been running the same route for years, a looping trail through the park near her apartment. But one Friday night, her routine took a sinister turn. The park was darker than usual. One of the streetlights near the entrance flickered weakly, casting eerie shadows across the pavement. Lila hesitated but brushed off her unease. She adjusted her headphones, letting the steady beat of her playlist drown out the quiet. The first mile was uneventful. The path was lined with trees that swayed gently in the breeze. Occasionally, she'd hear the rustle of leaves or the distant hoot of an owl. Nothing unusual. Then she noticed the sound. Footsteps. They weren't loud, just a faint crunching of gravel that seemed to fall in rhythm with her own. Lila glanced over her shoulder but saw no one. The park was empty. Shrugging it off, she picked up her pace. The footsteps quickened. Her heart began to race, the steady beat of her music no longer soothing but unnerving. She stopped abruptly, pulling out her earbuds. Silence. Lila turned in a slow circle, scanning the path behind her. Nothing. Only the swaying trees and the dim glow of the streetlights. "You're just imagining things," she muttered, shaking her head. She forced a laugh, the sound hollow in the empty park. As she resumed her run, the footsteps returned. Louder this time. Lila's skin prickled. She stopped again, her breath visible in the chilly night air. "Hello?" she called, her voice trembling. No answer. Her gut told her to leave, to get out of the park. She turned back toward the entrance, abandoning her usual route. Her pace quickened to a jog, then a sprint, the footsteps now pounding behind her. "Who's there?" she yelled, her voice echoing through the park. Still no response, but the footsteps didn't stop. They were closer now, almost right behind her. Lila's legs burned as she pushed herself harder, the streetlights ahead promising safety. She didn't dare look back. Finally, she burst out of the park, collapsing onto the sidewalk. Her chest heaved as she tried to catch her breath. She spun around, expecting to see someone emerge from the shadows. No one came. The park was silent, the path empty. A nervous laugh escaped her lips. Maybe she had imagined it. Maybe it was her own paranoia, amplified by the isolation of the night. But as she turned to head home, she saw something that made her blood run cold. On the sidewalk, illuminated by the flickering streetlight, was a single muddy footprint. It wasn't hers. The print was large, too large for any normal shoe. The edges were jagged, the shape distorted, as though it belonged to something that wasn't entirely human. Lila stared at it, her mind racing. Then, slowly, she became aware of something behind her, a faint rasping sound like labored breathing. Her body stiffened as the air grew heavy, colder than before. Against every instinct screaming at her to run, she turned around. The figure stood just a few feet away. It was tall, impossibly tall, its limbs too long and its head tilted unnaturally to one side. Its face, or what should have been a face, was a pale, featureless mask, save for two hollow pits where its eyes should have been. Lila couldn't move, couldn't scream. The creature tilted its head further as though studying her. Then, with a sudden, jerky motion, it stepped closer. Her survival instincts kicked in, and she bolted down the street, her lungs burning with each panicked breath. She didn't look back. When she finally reached her apartment, she slammed the door shut and locked it. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely turn the deadbolt. For hours, she sat on the floor, clutching her phone, her eyes glued to the door. She didn't call anyone. She couldn't. What would she even say? The next morning, the sun's light felt like a reprieve. She finally convinced herself to leave the apartment to prove it had all been in her head. When she stepped into the hallway, her breath caught. There on the floor outside her door was a single muddy footprint. Mia's apartment was nothing fancy, but it was hers. A small one-bedroom on the third floor of an old brick building. It had just enough charm to make up for its creaky floors and questionable plumbing. She had lived there peacefully for 6 months, until the knocking started. It was faint at first. A soft tap, tap, tap on her bedroom wall. She assumed it was the neighbors, maybe hanging a picture or moving furniture. But when she heard it at 2 a.m., she couldn't ignore the timing. The knocks weren't random. They came in sets of 3, always slow and deliberate. Mia pressed her ear to the wall, straining to hear any signs of life next door. Nothing. The next morning, she asked the building manager about the apartment on the other side of her wall. "No one's lived there in years," he said with a shrug. "Why? You hear something?" Mia forced a laugh, brushing it off as her imagination. But that night, the knocking came again. Tap, tap, tap. She clenched her fists, staring at the wall. "Hello? Who's there?" Silence. Then 3 more knocks. Tap, tap, tap. Mia's pulse quickened. She grabbed her phone and called the building manager. "I swear there's someone in the apartment next door," she said, her voice shaking. "Impossible," he replied. "That place is empty. I'll check it out in the morning." Morning couldn't come fast enough. Mia barely slept, and when she did, her dreams were filled with shadows and echoes of knocking. The building manager called her later that day. "I checked it out. No signs of anyone being there. Must have been the pipes." Pipes. She wasn't convinced, but what could she do? That night, she tried to ignore the knocks, pulling her blanket up to her chin and forcing herself to keep her eyes shut. The knocking didn't stop. Tap, tap, tap. It grew louder, more insistent. "Leave me alone," Mia screamed, her voice cracking. The knocking stopped. Relief washed over her, but it was short-lived. Slowly, she realized the sound had moved. It wasn't coming from the wall anymore. It was coming from the closet. Her throat tightened as she stared at the closet door, its shadow stretching across the floor in the dim light. "Mia," a voice whispered, low and gravelly, from behind the door. Her blood ran cold. She scrambled out of bed, grabbing her phone to call 911, but the line went dead. The closet door creaked open, just an inch, enough to see darkness beyond it, darker than the rest of the room. "Mia," the voice came again, louder this time, almost playful. She grabbed the nearest thing, a lamp, and hurled it at the closet door. The bulb shattered, plunging the room into near-total darkness. The only light came from the faint glow of the street lamp outside her window. The door swung open. Mia froze. A figure stepped out, tall and hunched, its movements jerky and unnatural. Its face was obscured by shadow, but its eyes, 2 pinpoints of white, glared at her with an intensity that made her knees buckle. It opened its mouth impossibly wide, revealing rows of jagged teeth. She bolted for the door, her bare feet slipping on the hardwood floor. The thing was faster. By the time she reached the hallway, she felt its icy breath on the back of her neck. She didn't remember how she made it outside, but when she finally stopped running, she was standing on the street, trembling in her pajamas. The building loomed behind her, its windows dark and lifeless. She never went back to the apartment. The building manager called a week later, telling her she'd left nearly everything behind. He also mentioned something odd. The tenant before you, they broke their lease early too. Said they kept hearing someone knocking. Funny coincidence, huh? Mia didn't laugh. She didn't say anything at all. But she knew one thing for certain. Whatever was in that apartment, it wasn't a coincidence. And it wasn't finished with her. Jake had always been a night shift kind of guy. The quiet hours, the stillness, they suited him. He worked as a security guard at an old office building downtown, a relic from the 1920s. The place had charm, sure, but it was mostly empty these days, with only a few businesses occupying the upper floors. Jake's job was to walk the halls, check the cameras, and keep things quiet. It was a slow Thursday night when he first noticed it. The elevator was moving on its own. He watched the security monitor as the ancient elevator crawled up from the lobby to the third floor, then back down to the second. No one had entered the building in hours, and the elevators were supposed to require a key card after 9 p.m. Jake frowned and grabbed his flashlight. Probably just a glitch, he told himself. These things were old. He made his way to the lobby, his footsteps echoing in the empty building. The elevator doors were closed when he arrived. The little light above the door showed it was on the third floor. Jake sighed. He hated going to the upper floors. They always felt wrong. The air was heavier and the silence seemed deeper. But it was his job. He pressed the button and waited. With a loud mechanical groan, the elevator descended. The doors creaked open, revealing the dimly lit interior. It was empty. Jake stepped inside, his fingers brushing the panel. Before he could press the button for the third floor, the doors slid shut on their own. The elevator jolted to life, carrying him upward. "Third floor it is," he muttered, trying to ignore the prickling sensation creeping up his neck. When the doors opened, the hallway was dark. The overhead lights flickered faintly, casting uneven shadows. Jake stepped out, shining his flashlight ahead. The air was cold, colder than it should have been. His breath fogged in front of him, and the faint smell of mildew filled his nostrils. He walked slowly, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The hallway stretched on longer than he remembered. The doors to the offices were all shut, but he felt like something was watching him, just out of sight. That's when he heard it. A faint metallic scraping sound, like nails dragging against metal. It echoed faintly, seeming to come from everywhere at once. "Hello?" Jake called out, his voice steady but uncertain. The scraping stopped. Then came the whispering. It was low at first, barely audible, like a breeze sneaking through a crack in the wall. But it grew louder, closer. The words were impossible to make out, a jumble of syllables that didn't make sense. Jake turned in a slow circle, his flashlight trembling in his grip. The hallway was empty, but the whispers were all around him now, filling his ears. The scraping started again, this time from behind him. Jake spun around, his flashlight landing on the elevator doors at the end of the hall. They were slightly ajar, and someone was standing between them. The figure was tall and thin, its face obscured by the shadows. Its head tilted unnaturally to one side, as though it didn't have the strength to hold it upright. "Hey!" Jake barked, stepping forward. "You're not supposed to be here!" The figure didn't move. Jake's heart pounded as he approached the elevator. "I'm calling the police!" The figure slowly raised a hand, long, bony fingers pointing directly at him. Its head twitched, the angle growing sharper, more inhuman. Jake stopped in his tracks. The elevator doors began to close, and as they did, the figure stepped forward, pressing its face into the narrow gap. Its eyes were black voids, its mouth stretching into a jagged, toothless grin. "Leave," it hissed, the words slicing through the air like a blade. The doors slammed shut, and the elevator began descending. Jake bolted for the stairwell, his mind racing. He needed to get out, now. When he reached the lobby, the elevator doors were open, waiting. The car was empty, but the faint whispering remained. Jake didn't finish his shift. He left his keys and badge at the desk and walked out into the night, never looking back. The next morning, the building manager called him. "Strange thing," the manager said. "Our cameras show you taking the elevator to the basement at 2 a.m., but we don't have a basement." Jake hung up the phone. He didn't care about the building's mysteries anymore. All he knew was this: he wasn't going back. The farmhouse had been in the Parker family for generations, sitting quietly on a stretch of desolate plains. Jenna had inherited it after her grandparents passed. She wasn't thrilled about moving there. It was old, creaky, and isolated, but she couldn't afford to live in the city anymore. So she packed her things and drove out to the middle of nowhere. The first few days were uneventful. Jenna spent her time cleaning and organizing, trying to make the old place feel like home. The house was filled with relics of the past: faded photographs, hand-carved furniture, and an antique mirror that hung in the upstairs hallway. The mirror was beautiful, framed in dark, ornate wood, but something about it unsettled her. Whenever she walked past, she felt compelled to glance into it, as if expecting to see something she shouldn't. One night, Jenna was reading in bed when she heard a soft creak from upstairs. She froze, her eyes darting to the ceiling. The farmhouse was old, creaks and groans were normal, but this sound was deliberate, like a single heavy footstep. "Hello?" she called, her voice breaking the stillness. No response. She grabbed her flashlight and tiptoed upstairs, her heart pounding. The hallway was dark, the air cold enough to make her shiver. The mirror caught her attention immediately. Its surface was darker than it should have been, as though the glass had absorbed the shadows around it. She shined her flashlight on it, but the beam didn't reflect back properly. Instead, it seemed to sink into the glass. Her stomach twisted as she stepped closer. That's when she saw it. A figure moved behind her in the reflection. Jenna spun around, the flashlight shaking in her grip. The hallway was empty. She turned back to the mirror, and the figure was still there. It was standing in the hallway behind her, closer now. Its head was bowed, its face hidden by a mess of dark, matted hair. "Get out!" she whispered to herself, her voice trembling. She backed away from the mirror and hurried downstairs, locking her bedroom door behind her. Sleep didn't come easily, but exhaustion eventually pulled her under. The next morning, she decided to take the mirror down. She grabbed a hammer and pried at the old nails holding it to the wall. When the last nail came free, the mirror tipped forward, and she caught a glimpse of the back. Carved into the wood were the words, "She watches." Jenna dropped the mirror, and it shattered on the floor, shards of glass scattering like fallen stars. Her breath came in short gasps as she stared at the broken pieces. Each shard reflected the same thing: the woman with the matted hair staring back at her from every fragment. That night, Jenna boarded up the upstairs hallway and vowed never to go near it again. But the house had other plans. The whispers started the next evening. Soft at first, unintelligible, like the wind playing tricks on her. Then they grew louder, clearer. The voice was raspy, feminine, and unmistakably coming from upstairs. Jenna refused to leave her room, clutching her phone like a lifeline. She called her best friend Emily, begging her to come over. "I'll be there in an hour." Emily promised. Jenna tried to stay calm, but as the minutes ticked by, the whispers turned into banging. Something was pounding against the boarded-up hallway upstairs. She covered her ears, tears streaming down her face, but the noise only grew louder. Then the boards splintered. Jenna screamed as the pounding stopped abruptly. The house was silent again, but she could feel it. She was here now. The door to her bedroom creaked open, and the temperature plummeted. Jenna pressed herself against the wall, shaking uncontrollably. In the doorway stood the woman. Her face was pale and bloated, her eyes black pits that seemed to swallow the light. Her mouth hung open unnaturally wide, her jaw slack as though unhinged. She stepped into the room, her bare feet dragging across the floor. Jenna grabbed the only thing within reach, a lamp, and hurled it at the figure. It passed through her like smoke. The last thing Jenna remembered was the woman reaching out, her cold, gnarled hand brushing against her cheek. When Emily arrived, she found Jenna curled up in a corner of the room, her eyes wide and vacant. The upstairs hallway was untouched, and there was no sign of the mirror or the woman. Jenna never spoke again. Evelyn moved into the apartment because it was cheap. Too cheap, honestly. The landlord had mumbled something about quirks when she signed the lease, but she didn't care. She needed a place, and this one came fully furnished. The apartment was cozy but outdated, with heavy drapes, a rotary phone that didn't work, and an ancient television set sitting in the corner of the living room. Evelyn hadn't seen a TV like that since she was a kid, boxy with rabbit ear antennas. It didn't even have a power button. The first night, she fell asleep to the sound of rain tapping against the windows. She was just beginning to drift off when the TV turned on by itself. Static filled the screen, flickering shadows across the room. Evelyn sat up in bed, her heart pounding. She crept into the living room, hugging her arms to her chest. The static crackled louder as she approached, like whispers hidden in the white noise. She tugged the plug from the wall and the screen went dark. Shaking her head, she muttered, "Old wiring," and went back to bed. The second night, it happened again. This time, she woke to a faint voice. She couldn't make out the words, but the sound was unmistakable, a low, rhythmic murmur coming from the living room. She didn't want to get up, but curiosity won. The TV was on again, static swirling across the screen. She stared at it, her reflection faintly visible in the glass. Behind her reflection, something moved. Evelyn spun around, but the room was empty. When she looked back at the TV, the static had changed. Shapes were forming in the chaos, fuzzy at first, but becoming clearer. She squinted, her breath catching in her throat. It was a face, pale, hollow-eyed, and staring straight at her. The static grew louder, the face on the screen pressing closer, now as if trying to push through the glass. Evelyn yanked the plug again and threw a blanket over the TV. She didn't sleep that night. By the third night, she decided to get rid of it. She called a junk removal service, but they wouldn't come until morning. So she shoved the TV into the hallway, slamming the door behind it. But at 3:12 a.m., a sharp knock woke her. She froze. No one should be outside her door at this hour. The knock came again, louder this time. Gathering her courage, she approached the door and peered through the peephole. The hallway was empty, but the TV was back. It sat in front of her door, the static visible through the screen even though it wasn't plugged in. Her hands shook as she opened the door. She pushed the TV to the far end of the hallway, her breath hitching with every step. When she returned to her apartment, she locked the door and pushed the couch in front of it. But the knocking continued. Bang! 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 She pressed her hands to her ears, trying to block out the noise. And then it stopped. The silence was worse. She turned slowly, her eyes drawn to the living room. The blanket had fallen to the floor, and the TV was back. It wasn't showing static anymore. The screen displayed her apartment. She stepped closer, her feet dragging as though something was pulling her. The camera angle shifted on the screen, zooming in on her. Then she saw it. Something behind her. It was tall, shadowy, its limbs stretched unnaturally long, its head tilted as it moved closer to her reflection on the screen. She turned around, but the room was empty. When she looked back at the TV, the shadow was gone. Instead, the screen displayed two words, flickering in pale, ghostly light. "Let me in." Evelyn grabbed her keys and ran, not stopping until she was in her car, speeding away from the building. She never returned for her belongings. Weeks later, she saw a news report about the apartment. A fire had gutted the building. No one was injured, but firefighters found something strange in the rubble, an old black and white TV. It was still intact, sitting upright in the ashes. The screen glowed faintly with static, even though there was no power. Greg had always been an avid hiker, the kind of guy who loved getting lost in nature for hours, but he'd never ventured into the Blackwood Forest until his friend Sarah dared him. "It's just a bunch of old ghost stories," Sarah had said, laughing. "You're not scared of a few campfire tales, are you?" Greg wasn't, at least not until he actually stepped into the forest. The trailhead was marked with a weathered wooden sign, its letters barely legible, "Stay on the path." The first few hours were uneventful. The forest was dense, the canopy blocking out most of the sunlight. The air was cool and damp, filled with the scent of moss and decaying leaves. It wasn't until late afternoon that he noticed something strange. The sounds of the forest, birds, rustling leaves, distant chirps, had gone silent. It was as though the entire forest was holding its breath. Greg paused, looking around. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. "Just nerves," he muttered to himself, but the words felt hollow. He pressed on, but the unease grew with every step. The trees seemed closer now, their twisted branches reaching toward him like skeletal fingers. And then he saw it. A figure standing off the trail, partially hidden behind a tree. "Hello?" Greg called out, trying to sound braver than he felt. The figure didn't move. It was tall, its limbs unnaturally long, its head cocked to one side. Greg squinted, trying to make out details, but the shadows clung to it like a second skin. "Hey!" he called again, louder this time. The figure stepped out from behind the tree, and Greg's stomach dropped. It wasn't human. Its body was impossibly thin, its arms and legs stretching far too long. Its face, or where its face should have been, was smooth and featureless. Greg stumbled back, tripping over a root and falling hard onto the path. The creature took a step forward, its movements slow and deliberate. Greg scrambled to his feet and ran. He didn't care which direction he was going, he just needed to get away. The forest seemed to close in around him, the trees growing thicker, their branches clawing at his arms and legs as he pushed through. He glanced over his shoulder and saw it still following him, gliding silently through the trees. "Stay on the path." The words from the trailhead sign echoed in his mind, but the path was long gone. He was deep in the forest now, surrounded by nothing but endless trees. His chest burned as he ran, his breaths coming in ragged gasps. Then he saw the cabin. It was small and dilapidated, its windows boarded up, its roof sagging under the weight of years. But it was shelter. Greg bolted for the door, throwing it open and slamming it shut behind him. The interior was dark, lit only by a faint sliver of light streaming through a crack in the wall. The air was thick with dust, and the floor creaked beneath his weight. He pressed his ear to the door, straining to hear. Silence. Had he lost it? Greg allowed himself a moment to catch his breath. He turned to survey the room, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. That's when he saw the carvings. The walls were covered in symbols, strange and angular, etched deep into the wood. Words were scrawled between the symbols, jagged and frantic. "It sees you. Don't look. Run." His flashlight flickered, and his pulse quickened. A noise came from outside. It was faint at first, a soft scraping, like nails dragging across wood. Greg backed away from the door, his eyes darting around the cabin for something, anything he could use as a weapon. His flashlight flickered again, then died completely, plunging him into darkness. The scraping grew louder, closer. Then the whispering began. It was low and guttural, a language Greg didn't understand, but the tone was unmistakable. Hunger. The door creaked open. Greg held his breath, pressing himself against the far wall. The whispering stopped, and then a voice, clear and sharp. "Why did you leave the path?" The question hung in the air, cold and accusing. Greg couldn't see it, but he could feel it. The air around him grew heavy, the temperature plummeting. A hand brushed against his shoulder, long, clawed fingers that sent a jolt of icy terror through his body. He screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the forest. The next morning, Sarah called the rangers when Greg didn't return. They found his car at the trailhead and followed the path deep into the forest. They never found Greg, but they did find the cabin. Inside, the walls were bare, save for one fresh carving. It watches.